A wealthy businessman smirks as he watches a ragged boy count his last few coins. "Go on," he taunts. "Buy something." But when the kid does, the entire cafe falls silent. No one saw this coming. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries filled the air of La Montagne, the most exclusive cafe in the city. Plush velvet chairs, golden chandeliers, and soft jazz playing in the background made it clear. This was a place for the elite. A place where the rich gathered, sipping espresso while discussing million-dollar deals. At a corner table, Victor Langford, a sharp-suited businessman, leaned back with an amused smirk. His expensive watch glinted under the soft cafe lights as he toyed with a golden credit card between his fingers. Across from him stood a boy, no older than 12, dressed in ragged clothes. His shoes were scuffed, his hoodie too big for his frail frame. He looked out of place, completely out of his depth. Victor chuckled, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "Well, didn't you say you wanted coffee? Go on, order something." The boy hesitated, his small fingers tightening around a few crumpled bills. The cashier, a young woman with a polite but wary expression, glanced between the boy and Victor. The cafe guests turned their heads, some whispering, others watching with veiled amusement. A few pitied the kid, but no one stepped in. Because in this world money meant power, and Victor had plenty of both. The boy, however, wasn't trembling. He wasn't backing down. Instead, he did something that made even Victor pause. He smiled. Victor's smirk faltered for a split second. He had expected fear, hesitation, maybe even tears, but a smile? That was unexpected. The boy stepped forward, placing his crumpled bills on the counter. "A cappuccino, please," he said, his voice calm, almost too steady for a kid his age. The cashier hesitated, looking at Victor for confirmation, but the businessman only laughed. "Go ahead," he said, waving a dismissive hand. The cafe guests were no longer pretending to mind their business. All eyes were glued to the unfolding scene. Victor forced a chuckle, though it came out hollow. "Should I? You're just some kid off the street." The boy took a slow sip of his cappuccino, unfazed. Then, setting the cup down, he reached into his hoodie pocket once more. This time, he pulled out something different, a small old photograph. He placed it on the table in front of Victor. A younger Victor stared back at him from the image, standing beside a man in a suit, a man Victor knew very well. His breath caught. His fingers twitched as he reached for the photograph. It was a picture of him and Daniel Carter. Daniel Carter. The name sent a rush of memories flooding through Victor's mind. His throat tightened. Daniel Carter, the business partner he had betrayed, the man who had mysteriously disappeared years ago. Victor's voice was barely above a whisper. "Where did you get this?" The boy's expression remained unreadable. Then finally, he spoke the words that sent chills down Victor's spine. "From my father's study." The cafe went dead silent. Victor's vision blurred. His heart pounded as realization hit him like a freight train. This boy was Daniel Carter's son. The weight of realization settled in Victor's chest like a stone. The name Daniel Carter had been buried in his past, a chapter he had carefully sealed away. Yet here it was, standing before him in the form of a boy who bore an uncanny resemblance to the man he had once called his friend. The murmurs in the cafe swelled and receded like waves crashing against a distant shore. Victor barely heard them. His mind was tangled in a web of memories, long-forgotten conversations, business deals that had once seemed so promising, and the eventual betrayal that had left Daniel Carter's name to fade into obscurity. The boy remained still, letting the silence stretch between them. He had no need to explain himself further. The photograph said enough. It was a relic of a past Victor had tried to forget, yet the boy had carried it here as though it were a weapon, a silent accusation wrapped in the sepia tones of an old memory. Victor forced himself to take a breath, though it felt tight in his chest. He wanted to dismiss the boy, to tell him that none of this mattered. But something about the calm in the boy's posture told him that this was not a chance encounter. The boy had come here deliberately, to this cafe, to this moment. Victor clenched his fists under the table, feeling the familiar frustration of being outmaneuvered. He had spent his life controlling the narrative, ensuring that people saw what he wanted them to see. But this boy had unraveled something raw inside him with nothing more than a single photograph. The cafe patrons had noticed the shift in the atmosphere. What had started as mild entertainment, an arrogant businessman mocking a poor child, had turned into something far more intriguing. People leaned forward, straining to catch snippets of what was happening. The air in the room felt charged, anticipation hanging like an unspoken challenge between the two. Victor knew he could not allow himself to look weak. He had spent decades crafting his image, ensuring that no one could shake the foundation of his power. Yet, the steady gaze of Daniel Carter's son threatened to do just that. Slowly, Victor exhaled. His pulse was still racing, but he forced himself to regain control. Whatever the boy wanted, whatever reason had brought him here, it could be handled. There was always a way to tip the scales back in his favor. But deep inside, a different fear gnawed at him. Because if this boy had come looking for him, then it meant the past had finally caught up. And no matter how much wealth, power, or influence he had amassed over the years, there were some debts that could never be paid off. Victor Langford had spent years building an empire on the ruins of someone else's dreams. And now, it seemed, the ghosts of those ruins had finally come to collect. The weight of the past pressed heavily against Victor's chest as he stared at the boy before him. The cafe, once a sanctuary of exclusivity and indulgence, now felt stifling. The murmured voices of patrons blurred into an indistinct hum, yet Victor knew their attention remained fixed on the scene unfolding before them. He forced himself to glance down at the photograph again. The edges were frayed, evidence of years spent tucked away, handled repeatedly by someone who refused to let go of the past. Daniel Carter's familiar face stared back at him, frozen in time. Victor's mind drifted to the last time he had seen Daniel, the day everything had changed. It had been in an office much grander than this cafe, lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. Daniel had been standing by the window, his back to Victor, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He had been talking about expansion, about how their business was finally on the verge of something great. Victor had listened, nodding at all the right moments. But his decision had already been made. The betrayal had been swift, surgical. A shift of ownership, a legal loophole exploited, a signature on a contract Daniel had never seen coming. By the time Daniel had turned around, the company they had built together was no longer his. And now, standing in this cafe, Victor wondered if that was the moment that had led to this one. If that betrayal had set in motion a chain of events that would eventually bring Daniel's son to him, armed not with money or power, but with something far more dangerous, the truth. The boy didn't move, nor did he break eye contact. He didn't need to. His very presence was a reminder that there were things Victor had chosen to ignore for too long. He felt a prickle of unease crawl down his spine. How had the boy found him? What did he know? And more importantly, what did he want? Victor had built his fortune on the belief that the past could be rewritten, that history belonged to those who controlled the narrative. But standing here, faced with this quiet, unwavering figure, he realized the past was not as easily buried as he had thought. A strange silence stretched between them, thick with the weight of unsaid words. The cafe no longer felt like Victor's domain, no longer a place where he dictated the rules. He could feel the shift, the power slipping from his grasp like sand through his fingers. For the first time in years, Victor Langford felt something foreign settle in his chest. Doubt. Victor clenched his jaw, forcing himself to regain composure. He had spent a lifetime shaping his world, ensuring no one could shake his position. And yet, Here he was, rattled by a child with nothing but an old photograph and a name that still haunted him. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping against the marble floor. Around him, the cafe's patrons continued to watch, some feigning indifference, others outright staring. They smelled tension like predators circling wounded prey. Victor despised that. He had always been the one in control, the one people envied, feared, admired. Not today. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and studied the boy. He was younger than Victor had expected, no more than 12 or 13. Yet there was something unsettling in his demeanor. He was calm, composed. Too composed for someone his age. Victor's mind churned, assessing possibilities. If this boy was truly Daniel Carter's son, then where had he been all these years? Why now? He glanced down at the card the boy had used to pay. A Centurion card. A card so exclusive that only a handful of people in the world had access to it. The kind of card that spoke of silent, generational wealth. This boy wasn't just some orphan or lost child trying to reclaim a broken past. He had power. That changed everything. Victor straightened. He had spent decades navigating the world of wealth, learning that money wasn't the only thing that mattered. It was perception, influence, leverage. And right now, he had none of it. But that didn't mean he couldn't take it back. The boy finally moved, lifting the coffee cup to his lips. He sipped slowly, his expression unreadable. Victor exhaled sharply. If this was a game, then it was time to start playing. "You've made your point," Victor said, keeping his voice even. "You have money. You have my attention. Now tell me, what do you want?" The boy placed the cup down with deliberate slowness. There was no rush, no urgency in his movements. That unnerved Victor more than he cared to admit. Still, the boy didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket once more. Victor tensed. Another photograph? A document? A letter from Daniel Carter himself? Number what the boy pulled out was far worse. A key. Small, unremarkable. Yet Victor's breath hitched the moment he saw it. He recognized it instantly. Years ago, Daniel Carter had owned a private study, a room filled with his most confidential files, contracts, business plans, personal letters. When Victor had taken over the company, he had ordered the study sealed, its contents supposedly lost. Yet, somehow, this boy had the key. Victor's pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't just about an old betrayal anymore. This boy wasn't here for answers. He was here for justice. A cold sweat broke out at the back of Victor's neck. The cafe around him felt smaller, suffocating. His thoughts scrambled for a logical explanation. The study was supposed to be inaccessible, its contents long buried beneath layers of legal battles and strategic misdirection. Yet this boy, Daniel Carter's son, sat before him with the key to secrets Victor had worked his entire life to keep hidden. He gritted his teeth. He needed to regain control. "So," Victor said, keeping his voice neutral, "you have a key. What does that prove?" The boy tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Then, without breaking eye contact, he slid the key across the table. Victor hesitated before picking it up. The cold metal pressed against his palm like a weight heavier than gold. The boy finally spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried enough force to send a chill down Victor's spine. "It means you can no longer hide." The words landed like a blow. For years, Victor had buried his past beneath layers of wealth and power, convincing himself that what he had done to Daniel Carter had been necessary. Business was business, survival of the fittest. But this boy had just reminded him that some ghosts refused to stay buried. Victor's grip tightened around the key. His mind raced through the implications. If this boy had access to Daniel Carter's old study, then he had access to something far more dangerous: proof. And proof was the one thing Victor Langford could not afford to be exposed. Victor forced himself to think. There had to be a way out of this. A way to reclaim control before things spiraled beyond his grasp. If this boy had the key, then he had probably already seen what was inside. But how much did he truly understand? Victor needed to be careful. He needed to buy himself time. He exhaled and placed the key back on the table, sliding it toward the boy. "You have my attention," he said, his voice smooth again, measured. "But tell me, what is it that you want? Money? Influence? Revenge?" The boy didn't react. His hands remained steady, his breathing even. There was no sign of hesitation, no trace of greed, and that terrified Victor more than anything else, because money he could handle, greed he could manipulate, revenge he could anticipate. But whatever this boy wanted, it wasn't any of those things. That made him unpredictable. And unpredictability was the one thing Victor Langford did not know how to control. The air between them grew heavier, the tension thick enough to suffocate. Victor could feel the cafe patrons still watching, waiting for whatever was coming next. But the boy simply lifted his coffee cup again, taking another sip as if he had all the time in the world. Victor clenched his jaw. "You don't need to play games, boy. I know who you are. I know what your father tried to do." The boy's eyes flickered with something unreadable. He remained silent. Victor leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "The world isn't fair. Your father learned that the hard way. And if you think you can change that by showing up with an old key, you're mistaken." The boy finally spoke, his voice steady. "I didn't come here to change the world." He set his coffee down. "I came to change yours." Victor's stomach twisted, because in that moment, he understood something that had eluded him before. This boy wasn't here for a fight. He wasn't here for money or threats. He was here to dismantle everything Victor Langford had built. And worst of all, he had already started. Victor Langford had spent years constructing an empire fortified by power, wealth, and the erasure of inconvenient truths. He had learned early on that money had a way of silencing the past, that carefully placed deals and legal maneuvers could rewrite history to favor those who knew how to wield them. Yet sitting in this cafe, staring at the young boy across from him, he felt something he had not experienced in decades: helplessness. It was not just the presence of the boy that unsettled him, nor even the photograph of Daniel Carter that had resurfaced like a ghostly reminder of the past. It was the key. A small, simple object, yet it carried with it the weight of a mistake Victor had spent his life trying to bury. There were secrets that should have remained locked away, sealed in a past long forgotten. But somehow, impossibly, this boy, Daniel Carter's son, had found his way to the very heart of them. The cafe, with its luxurious chandeliers and meticulously curated ambiance, no longer felt like a sanctuary. Instead, it felt like a courtroom, and Victor was the one being judged. He could sense the change in the air, the subtle way the patrons had grown more attentive, their whispers threading through the background like static. They had watched him mock the boy earlier, indulging in the spectacle of a rich man belittling someone beneath him. Now the energy had shifted. They sensed something had changed, but they did not know what. Victor prided himself on control, on knowing how to manipulate the tides of a conversation before they turned against him. He had built his fortune on mastering the art of perception, of ensuring that he always held the upper hand. Yet in this moment, as the boy sat across from him, calm, composed, and utterly unshaken, Victor realized he had lost something invaluable: leverage. The weight of the key pressed against his palm as he turned it over between his fingers. He recognized it instantly, knew exactly where it had come from. Years ago, when he had taken everything from Daniel Carter, there had been one place he had left untouched: Carter's private study. It had been locked, sealed away as a relic of a past Victor had ensured could no longer threaten him. Whatever remained inside had been deemed irrelevant, unnecessary in the grand scheme of his growing success. And yet somehow this boy had gained access to it. That changed everything. For years, Victor had comforted himself with the belief that the past was just that. The past. That once a chapter was closed, it could not be reopened. He had convinced himself that what he had done to Daniel Carter had been a necessary decision, a simple transaction in the ruthless world of business. Carter had been too sentimental, too idealistic to survive at the highest levels of corporate power. If Victor had not taken control, someone else would have. That was what he told himself. That was what had allowed him to sleep at night. But now, as the weight of the key burned against his skin, he understood something that made his blood turn cold. The past had never been erased. It had simply been waiting. The boy's silence was more unsettling than any confrontation Victor had ever faced. There was no anger in his expression, no desperation or plea for retribution. He did not look like someone seeking revenge or trying to reclaim a fortune. He looked like someone who had already won. Victor's mind scrambled for a way out. Money had always been his weapon, the thing that could turn enemies into allies, dissolve conflicts before they escalated. He had bought his way out of worse situations than this. But as he studied the boy across from him, he realized that money would be useless here. This was not someone looking for a payout. This was someone who wanted something far more dangerous: truth. The thought made Victor's stomach churn. If the study had been breached, then everything inside had been exposed. The documents, the records, the proof of the maneuverings he had orchestrated to remove Daniel Carter from his own company. If the boy had access to all of that, then Victor was no longer facing a minor inconvenience. He was facing destruction. A long breath escaped his lips, measured and careful, but inside, panic was clawing at his ribs. He had spent his entire life ensuring that no one held power over him. Now, for the first time in decades, he was no longer the one in control. For a brief moment, he considered taking the offensive, denying everything, twisting the truth until it no longer resembled the past this boy believed he knew. He had done it before, rewriting narratives so seamlessly that even those who had been wronged had questioned their own memories. But there was something about the way the boy looked at him, something in his eyes that made Victor hesitate. This was not someone who could be easily manipulated. A cold realization settled over Victor. The game he had always played, the one where money, power, and influence dictated the rules, was no longer the one being played. The boy was not looking for a fight. He was not here to demand restitution or beg for acknowledgement. He was here to dismantle everything Victor had built, and he had already started. The boy finally stood, slow and deliberate, his movements unhurried. He did not need to say anything more. The key had already spoken for him. The truth was out, and there was no way to contain it now. Victor watched as he adjusted his hoodie, seemingly unfazed by the storm he had just unleashed. Then, as if offering a final verdict, he looked Victor in the eye one last time. It was not a threat. It was not a warning. It was certainty. Without another word, the boy turned and walked away, weaving through the café with the quiet confidence of someone who had already set the pieces in motion. He did not glance back, did not offer any parting remark. He simply left, letting the silence settle like a noose tightening around Victor's neck. The café felt colder now, the expensive decor meaningless in the face of what had just transpired. Victor remained seated, his grip still tight around the key, his body tense with the weight of the moment. He barely noticed the whispers that spread through the café, barely registered the way the air had changed around him. For years, he had believed himself untouchable, a man above consequence. But as he sat there, alone in the aftermath, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The past was no longer behind him. It was here, and it had come to collect. Victor Langford remained seated long after the boy had left, his fingers still curled around the cold metal of the key. The café had returned to its usual rhythm: baristas steaming milk, the clinking of porcelain cups, the murmur of conversations. But to Victor, the world felt eerily still. It was as if everything around him had lost its meaning, as if the finely curated illusion of his existence had been shattered in a single, quiet moment. He had spent a lifetime believing he was untouchable. Power had insulated him from consequence, wealth had rewritten history at his command, and influence had kept his past buried where it belonged. Yet here he was, in the heart of the city he had once ruled, and for the first time, he felt small. The key pressed against his palm like a cruel reminder that no empire was built without a foundation of broken promises, and his had been constructed atop the ruin of Daniel Carter. Victor had always thought of the past as something that could be controlled, contained, reshaped to fit whatever narrative suited him best. But he had been wrong. The past was not a thing to be erased. It was a force, patient and relentless, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And today, it had found him. Rising from his chair, he ignored the quiet stares of the café patrons. There had been a time when he would have relished their attention, ensuring that every glance cast his way was one of admiration or envy. Now he could feel their curiosity turn into something else: speculation, doubt. He had been exposed, even if they didn't yet understand how. Stepping outside, the city's sharp autumn air bit against his skin, but the chill came from within. The towering skyline that once made him feel invincible now loomed over him, oppressive and indifferent. He had built this world for himself, carved his name into its streets, yet it suddenly felt as if it no longer belonged to him. His driver was waiting by the curb, the black sedan gleaming under the dull light of the late afternoon. Slipping inside, he closed the door and leaned back against the leather seat, his mind spiraling through possibilities. The study, the documents, the evidence. It was all supposed to be out of reach, yet the boy had found it. That meant someone had helped him, someone with knowledge, access, intent. Victor had spent his career predicting his enemies before they could strike. Yet he had never anticipated this. He had planned for competitors, for legal battles, for market crashes, but not for the son of a man he had destroyed coming back to finish what his father had started. The car wove through the streets, but Victor barely noticed the familiar sights of the city passing by. His thoughts remained trapped in the past, in memories that had long since dulled, but now burned with renewed intensity. He saw Daniel Carter as he had been all those years ago, ambitious, brilliant, and hopelessly naive. Daniel had believed in loyalty, in building something with integrity. That had been his downfall. Victor had not had the luxury of such ideals. Back then, the decision had been easy. He had told himself that Carter had been too soft, too blind to the realities of business. That taking the company had not just been necessary but inevitable. But sitting in the back of the car, the weight of the key still heavy in his pocket, Victor could no longer silence the question that gnawed at the edges of his mind. The car pulled up in front of his penthouse, and for the first time in years, Victor hesitated before stepping inside. His home, once a fortress, felt hollow. The pristine floors, the panoramic views, the meticulously curated art on the walls, it all felt meaningless in the face of what was coming. He had always assumed that when the end came, it would be at the hands of an ambitious rival, a market failure, a scandal he could no longer contain. He had never imagined it would come in the form of a boy with his father's eyes. Moving through the dimly lit corridors, he loosened his tie, his mind restless. He needed a plan, a way to regain control before everything unraveled. There had to be a way out. There always was. But as he stood in his vast, empty living room, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the glass, he realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he believed that anymore. The study in Daniel Carter's old estate had been untouched for years, sealed, locked away, abandoned. Whatever had remained inside should have been lost to time. But the boy had found it. That meant the past had not just been uncovered, it had been prepared. Victor knew better than to believe in coincidences. Someone had orchestrated this. Someone had known that the truth would be his undoing. A slow dread settled in his bones. It was already too late. The boy hadn't come to negotiate or threaten. He hadn't been seeking money, power, or even recognition. He had simply been delivering a message. One final quiet warning before the storm. Victor ran a hand over his face, exhaustion pressing against him. He had spent years building walls around himself, ensuring that no one could get close enough to strike. And yet here he was, standing in the wreckage of his own illusion. The past had caught up, and there was nowhere left to run. Victor Langford had always understood power. It was not about money nor about influence. Those things were fleeting, temporary, granted only to those who could wield them correctly. Real power was about control. Control over perception, control over the past, control over the future. For decades, he had built his empire on this principle, ensuring that no loose ends remained, that no mistake could return to haunt him. Every risk had been calculated, every threat neutralized before it could grow into something unmanageable. And yet, here he was, watching it all unravel before his very eyes. The first cracks had begun as whispers, rumors stretching through the business world, carried by journalists who had suddenly taken an interest in how exactly Langford Industries had come to be. It was not uncommon for successful men to be scrutinized, but this was different. This was surgical. The attacks were too precise, the leaks too well-timed. Someone was moving pieces in the shadows, setting fire to the carefully constructed version of history Victor had worked so hard to maintain. And the worst part? He already knew who was behind it. The boy had left nothing to chance. He had not come to make demands, had not attempted blackmail or revenge in the traditional sense. Instead, he had done something far worse. He had told the truth, and Victor had no way of stopping it. By morning, the storm had grown beyond containment. It was no longer just business articles speculating on the fall of a corporate giant. The mainstream media had picked up the scent, and now Victor Langford's name was everywhere. The internet was a ruthless machine feeding on scandal, and within hours accusations were spreading like wildfire. He sat in his penthouse office, surrounded by screens flashing headlines that felt like nails sealing the coffin of his reputation. Victor Langford, the business tycoon with a stolen empire? New evidence suggests Langford's takeover of Carter Enterprises was fraudulent. Exposing the man behind the fortune, the secrets Victor Langford never wanted you to know. Every story was more damning than the last, each one carefully structured to chip away at his carefully curated image. But it wasn't just the media that turned against him. It was the people closest to him. His board members, once unwaveringly loyal, had started issuing statements distancing themselves from him. Some had gone as far as resigning altogether. Investors, sensing the blood in the water, were pulling out of deals, causing the company's stock to plummet at an alarming rate. Victor had weathered financial turbulence before, but this was different. This wasn't about money. This was about legacy. And legacies, once tainted, were nearly impossible to restore. In the end, people did not care about numbers. They cared about narratives. And the new narrative being built around him was not one of a successful businessman. It was one of a man who had cheated, manipulated, and stolen his way to the top. The truth no longer mattered. Perception had already decided his fate. Victor Langford had spent his life surrounded by the world's most powerful people. He had walked into rooms where deals worth billions were sealed with a handshake, where men with influence beyond comprehension dictated the course of entire industries. He had believed that such power made him untouchable. But now, as he sat in the cold silence of his office, he realized that power had never been real. When things were good, people clung to him, seeking favor, seeking opportunity. But the moment the tide shifted, the moment there was even a whisper of vulnerability, those same people scattered like rats abandoning a sinking ship. His phone, once filled with an endless stream of calls, was now silent. Even those who had once called him a friend refused to be seen with him. His most trusted advisors were nowhere to be found, each one protecting their own interests. This was not a storm that could be waited out. This was not a temporary setback. This was the end. Victor's thoughts turned back to the boy. He had underestimated him, dismissed him as nothing more than a minor inconvenience. He had believed that time had erased the sins of the past, that money had smoothed over the betrayals buried beneath his success. But now, it was clear. The past had never forgotten him. It had simply been waiting for the right moment to strike. The final blow came not from the media, nor from the boardrooms where his name was being stripped from every association. It came in the form of a legal document delivered to his desk with the precision of an executioner's blade. Daniel Carter's son had filed a lawsuit against him, challenging the legality of the takeover that had built Langford Industries. The implications were staggering. If the courts ruled in the boy's favor, everything Victor had built would be dismantled. The very foundation of his fortune would be deemed fraudulent, and every deal that followed would crumble under legal scrutiny. For decades he had played the system, ensuring that nothing could ever be traced back to him, that no one could ever contest his empire. But the evidence had survived. The boy had found it, and now he had presented it to the world with the unshakable certainty of someone who had nothing to lose. For the first time in his life, Victor felt powerless. His lawyers scrambled trying to find a way out, but he could already see it in their faces. They knew. There was no way out. The only thing left was the inevitable downfall. His empire was collapsing. His fortune, his influence, his name, all of it was slipping away. And the worst part, it had not been taken from him. It had simply returned to its rightful owner. By nightfall, Victor Langford stood in his penthouse, staring at the city that had once been his kingdom. The lights of the skyline stretched out before him, but they no longer felt like his own. The empire he had built had been erased in less than a week. His name, once revered, was now synonymous with corruption and deception. He had spent his life believing that power was eternal, that wealth could shield him from consequences. But now he understood the truth. Power was borrowed, and debts always came due. The irony was inescapable. He had once stolen a future that was not his to take, and now his own future had been taken from him. Somewhere in the city, a boy was watching as justice unfolded, not through revenge, not through violence, but through truth. And Victor Langford, once untouchable, had become nothing more than a man trapped in the ruins of his own making. The world did not stop when Victor Langford fell. The stock market continued its relentless fluctuations, businesses opened and closed, the city's skyline remained unchanged. But within the corridors of power, within the circles where Victor had once commanded absolute authority, his absence was felt like the fading echo of a name that no longer carried weight. Langford Industries, once a towering pillar of wealth and dominance, had begun its slow and inevitable collapse. The lawsuit had ignited a storm, and as more evidence surfaced, the company's foundations began to crack. Investors withdrew, partnerships dissolved, and board members scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. What had taken decades to build was now dismantling itself, piece by piece. Victor had once thought that if he were to lose, it would be in some grand, dramatic fashion, a singular moment of destruction. Instead, his empire rotted from within, its own people turning against him, not out of loyalty to justice, but out of sheer self-preservation. The illusion of power had been shattered, and now those who had once relied on him saw only a liability where a king had once stood. His name was being removed from corporate records, his presence erased from the walls of boardrooms where he had once dictated the course of industries. Victor Langford no longer existed in the world he had created, and somewhere out there, Daniel Carter's son was watching. For the boy, this was never about money. It had never been about reclaiming the wealth his father had lost, nor about vengeance in the way Victor had once assumed. It had been about correction, about restoring something that had been unjustly taken, about ensuring that the sins of the past were not allowed to remain buried. He did not celebrate when the headlines changed, when Langford Industries became synonymous with fraud and corruption. He did not relish in the news of Victor's legal battles, of the desperate attempts to salvage what remained of his fortune. There was no satisfaction in the destruction of a man, only in the restoration of the truth. With every passing day, the world moved forward, and Victor Langford became just another lesson in history. A warning, rather than a name to be revered. The boy had ensured that his father's story would not be erased, that the man who had once stood for integrity would not be forgotten. But for Victor, there was no redemption waiting at the end of his fall. His penthouse, once a symbol of status and invincibility, had become a prison of his own making. The luxury that had once surrounded him now felt meaningless, hollow. The city lights that stretched beyond his windows no longer felt like something he commanded, but rather something he had been exiled from. The legal battles were endless. His assets were being frozen, his accounts drained, his properties sold to cover the mounting costs of lawsuits and settlements. He fought at first, his instinct for survival refusing to let go, but deep down, he knew he had already lost. Wealth had always been his armor, his weapon against the world. But now, he was defenseless. In the end, it was not a grand, dramatic downfall that defined Victor Langford's fate. It was something quieter, more insidious. The world simply moved on without him. Once, people had spoken his name with admiration or fear. Now they barely spoke it at all. The offices that had once been his domain were now occupied by new names, new leaders who sought to erase every trace of him. The deals he had brokered, the empire he had built, it all belonged to someone else now. And for the first time in his life, Victor understood what it meant to be truly forgotten. Somewhere in the city, the boy walked past the very café where it had all begun. It had been weeks since that moment, yet he had not returned, nor had he ever needed to. He did not linger. He did not stop to look at the place where he had first confronted Victor Langford, nor did he feel any need to, because the battle had never been about that single moment. It had always been about the long game, and in the end, he had won. The past had been corrected, the truth had been restored, and Victor Langford had become nothing more than a ghost of his own making. The city did not remember Victor Langford. His name, once a towering presence in boardrooms and financial circles, had been scrubbed from history with a cold efficiency that mirrored how he had once erased Daniel Carter. The media had moved on to new scandals, the business world had adjusted without him, and the empire he had built had been dismantled into nothingness. But the boy had never sought to destroy him. He had only sought to correct the record. Walking through the streets where his father's name had once been whispered with respect, he no longer carried the weight of unfinished business. The lawsuit had concluded, not just in financial retribution, but in acknowledgement. The courts had ruled in favor of Daniel Carter's legacy, overturning the fraudulent acquisition that had stolen his work. It was a victory not measured in money, but in the truth being restored. Langford Industries had been dissolved, its remaining assets liquidated. Its former employees had moved on, some finding work in companies that had once been their competitors, others simply adapting to a world that no longer belonged to Victor Langford. But what mattered most was that Daniel Carter's name had been reclaimed. The boy had not kept a single dollar of the settlements. Instead, every cent had been funneled into something greater. A foundation now stood in Daniel Carter's name, dedicated to funding young entrepreneurs who lacked the wealth and connections to bring their ideas to life. A new generation of dreamers would rise, not through greed or exploitation, but through the values his father had once held dear. The past had been rewritten not through manipulation or deception, but through truth. And that was the greatest victory of all. The world had always belonged to the powerful, to those who understood how to wield influence like a weapon. But now it belonged to those who refused to be erased. Victor Langford had once believed he could bend history to his will, that money could bury the sins of the past. But the past had proved more resilient than he had anticipated. Now he lived in obscurity, not as a man defeated in battle, but as a man who had simply ceased to exist in the eyes of the world. His penthouse was gone, replaced by an apartment with no staff, no lavish decor, no constant stream of advisors ensuring his control over the business world. The silence was suffocating. his days marked only by the slow realization that he no longer mattered. There had been no dramatic ending, no final confrontation where he could plead his case or fight for redemption. His fate had simply unfolded in the quiet way that all forgotten men eventually fade. His phone never rang. His name was never mentioned. His legacy had been undone with the same precision he had once used to destroy another's, and now he had to live with it. The boy stood at the edge of the city skyline, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. He carried no resentment, no hatred. He had never sought vengeance, only justice. His father had not lived to see this moment, but the boy knew that somewhere, beyond the confines of the world Victor Langford had once ruled, Daniel Carter had won. It had taken years, patience, and an unwavering belief in the power of the truth. But in the end, the past had corrected itself. The empire built on deception had collapsed. The man who thought himself untouchable had faded into irrelevance, and the legacy that had once been stolen had finally been restored. The city's lights shimmered in the distance, a reminder that the world never stopped moving forward. And as the boy turned to leave, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Some victories do not come from fighting. Some victories come simply from refusing to be erased. The past has a way of catching up, no matter how deeply it is buried. Some believe power is permanent, that wealth and influence can shield them from the truth. But history has proven, time and time again, that the past does not forget. Victor Langford built his empire on deception, convinced that his actions would never come back to haunt him. But in the end, the very thing he tried to erase became the force that erased him. His story is a lesson, a reminder that no matter how powerful someone appears to be, they are never truly untouchable. But this is not just about Victor Langford. It is about every person who has ever been silenced, every individual who has lost something to greed, betrayal, or injustice. It is about those who have been told that the truth does not matter, that power will always rewrite history. But the truth does matter. It always has. And the boy in this story proves that sometimes the greatest form of justice is simply refusing to let the past be forgotten. Have you ever witnessed injustice? Have you ever seen the powerful try to erase their wrongdoings? What would you have done if you were in the boy's place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful stories that remind us why the truth will always matter. Because in the end, history belongs to those who refuse to be erased.